Nebraska, 1888. A mocked man builds into the earth. The earth remembers why. The sod walls were 3 feet thick, and Clara noticed this before she noticed anything else. Before the warmth. Before the smell of pine smoke and rendered tallow rising from the cast-iron stove set against the north wall. Before the low yellow light of 2 oil lamps burning with matched, deliberate wicks, as though whoever had lit them had thought carefully about the geometry of flame. She pressed her fingers around the tin cup the man had placed in her hands, and the heat moved through the metal and into her knuckles with a force that made her breath catch. Outside the single window, cut 14 inches deep into the south-facing wall, the Nebraska plain had ceased to exist. What had been a gray January afternoon was now a horizontal wall of white in motion, and the sound it made against the packed earth was not wind in any ordinary sense. It was something lower and older, something that had been building for months in the long corridors of the northern sky and had arrived, finally, to collect what it was owed. Elias' cord moved without urgency. He was 38 years old and carried himself with the precision of a man who had decided, years before, what he intended to do and had simply been doing it ever since. He checked the stove damper. He confirmed the water level in the indoor cistern. He set a cast-iron pot over the heat and said nothing, because nothing required saying. The walls held. The lamp did not flicker. The temperature inside the earthen room had not moved from the 61 degrees it registered when they came through the door. 3 hours earlier, Clara Wren had been standing at the Granger depot with her trunk beside her on the platform and a letter still folded in her coat pocket. The letter that had brought her 800 miles from Cincinnati with a promise attached to it. Douglas Harwick had come down the platform steps, regarded her for 30 seconds, spoken 4 quiet words to his foreman, and returned his buggy with the ease of a man to whom disappointment was always someone else's burden. The foreman had pressed $2 silver into her hand and said the next eastbound train departed Thursday. It was Monday. She had 43 cents remaining. When the sky turned the color of a bruise going green along the northwest horizon, she had started walking. Not toward any destination, simply away from the stillness of a platform where she was no longer wanted. It was Elias Cord who found her on the county road, her fingers too rigid to hold the fence wire she had been following for direction, her coat already conceding to the wind's first pressure. He had not asked her name. He took her arm and turned her south, and they walked a half-mile to his claim in a silence that felt, somehow, like shelter before either of them had reached it. She did not yet know what the county called this place. Douglas Harwick had come to Colfax County 3 years earlier with $40,000, a hired surveyor, and the specific ambitions of a man who believed that wealth, applied at sufficient scale, was indistinguishable from wisdom. By the spring of 1886, he owned 11,000 acres of the best water grassland in the Platte Valley, a 3-story ranch house with imported glass windows, and a reputation for making other men aware of the inadequacy of their choices, without saying anything direct enough to argue against. He was 44 years old and had never been genuinely wrong about anything that mattered, and this record had produced in him a certainty that functioned less like confidence and like weather, ambient, unquestioned, total. When Elias Cord filed his claim on the 80-acre parcel in the depression west of Cottonwood Creek, Harwick happened to be standing at the land office counter, completing a timber purchase. He read the parcel number over the clerk's shoulder and made a short, flat sound in his throat. "Cord," he said, though they had never been introduced. "That land is a bowl. Floods in spring. Alkali all summer. No windbreak for 3 miles in any direction. You'll be eating gumbo mud come April." Elias signed his name without looking up. The parcel description was honest about its ugliness. The claim sat 30 feet below the surrounding plain in a natural depression rimmed on the north and west by a low ridge of chalk and shale, and every experienced homesteader who had looked at it had kept walking. Harwick had tried twice to acquire it himself, not because it had value, but because idle land offended his sense of dominion, and both attempts had been declined. That spring, Harwick spent $4,200 constructing what he called a model ranch complex on the high ground north of Granger. White-painted board and batten. A cupola with a weather vane shipped from a firm in St. Louis. A wraparound porch facing west into every weather system the continent could produce. The Granger Courier covered the completion party in 2 full columns. Standing on that porch with imported whiskey, Harwick described Elias Cord's low-ground claim to a ring of men who were prepared to find it amusing. "The boy's built himself a badger hole," he said. "Come winter, he'll be hibernating." The phrase traveled through the county at the speed of contempt. By August, men said it at the feed store, the saloon, the church steps. They said it without malice, which made it worse. Easily, repeatedly, with the careless confidence of people who believe they are simply repeating a good joke rather than building the walls of someone else's prison. Elias heard it. He kept digging. The chalk layer broke at 11 feet, and beneath it the ground was dry. He drove the probe 3 times at 3 different points across the parcel, and each time the result was the same. Below the alkali crust, below the frost line, below the chalk shelf that the county had used as evidence of the land's fundamental worthlessness. The subsoil was packed sand and gravel, ancient riverbed material, drainage so efficient it was impervious to frost heave, impervious to the spring saturation that destroyed high-ground foundations every April. The depression that looked like a flood basin was in fact a watershed that collected water hard and expelled it fast, leaving behind a firmness that Harwick's expensive high ground could not match. Elias stood in the bowl of his claim on a September morning and allowed himself 1 minute of stillness before he began. His father had farmed sod in Missouri and spoken very little, but observed everything. He had knelt once beside a creek bank cut to expose its strata, clay, then sand, then gravel, and told Elias that most men look at the surface and call it the whole truth. "The surface is just the argument," he had said, pressing his palm into the exposed gravel. "The truth is always lower down." Elias built into the north face of the chalk ridge. He cut the structure 6 feet into the hillside, leaving a full earth roof and 3 earthen walls. The south face he framed with salvaged cottonwood timber from a failed mill upstream. Chinked with mortar, he mixed himself from chalk dust, clay, and slake lime. He oriented the south wall 15 degrees east of true south, morning light on one side, northwest deflection on the other. The floor measured 22 feet by 14. Ceiling at center, 7 feet, for inches. Wall thickness on the buried sides, 3 feet at minimum. He installed a cast iron stove with a horizontal flue pipe running 8 full feet to the east wall before exiting, extracting maximum heat before exhaust. Below the floor, he cut a root cellar 9 feet by 6 and packed the walls with river sand. The entire structure cost $61 in materials. It cost 4 months of his labor. When he drove the last peg, he did not stand back to admire it. He went inside, started a fire, and felt the earth hold every degree of it, quietly, efficiently, without ceremony or waste, exactly as he had known it would. By the spring of 1887, the Badger Hole had become a fixed landmark in county conversation. It surfaced at the hardware counter in March. A Methodist minister borrowed it, without attribution, for a sermon on the danger pride expressed through isolation. Children riding past on a county road would sometimes shout the phrase toward the low ridge and ride on faster, half convinced that whatever lived in the silence below the chalk was listening. Elias was finishing. His root cellar held 280 pounds of smoked pork, 40 pounds of dried beans, 60 pounds of cornmeal, and 20 gallons of rendered lard sealed in crocks. He had laid in 4 cords of split firewood, enough for 90 days of sustained burn. A cistern inside the structure held 140 gallons, fed by a buried pipe from a spring on the east ridge face. A second cistern outside served the horses, which lived in a stable cut into the ridge on the same principle as the house. Earth-roofed, 3 earthen sides, dark and low and steady at 70 degrees regardless of what the sky produced. He watched the animals that October with particular attention of a man who understands that creatures unencumbered by certainty read the world more accurately than men who are certain. The cattle on Harwick's high pasture drifted south whenever the northwest wind came, as though they perceived something in the air's composition that a weather vane could not record. The crows left the cottonwood grove 2 weeks ahead of their usual departure. The creek iced hard along both banks before the center froze, a sign the old-timers read as a winter arriving fast and total, with no warning worth the name. On the morning of January 11th, 1888, Elias loaded a final cord of wood into the house and banked the stove for a long, uninterrupted burn. The sky that morning was the color of old iron. By afternoon, along the northwestern edge of everything visible, it had shifted to something different. The bruised, greenish yellow that forms when atmospheric pressures collide with force the clouds above them cannot absorb. It was not a color that invited interpretation. It was a color that made a statement. January 12, 1888. The temperature at Granger Station registered 32 degrees Fahrenheit at 10 in the morning and fell to minus 18 by 4 in the afternoon. The storm that struck the Central Plains that day was not a blizzard in any ordinary meaning of the word. It was a wall, a horizontal column of wind-driven ice crystals traveling at 62 miles per hour, reducing visibility to absolute zero in under 3 minutes, dropping temperature at a rate that froze exposed livestock where they stood in the field. It did not escalate. One moment the air was still and gray. The next, the world had a new sound, a continuous, undifferentiated roar that was not loud so much as total, as though the atmosphere itself had ceased to be background and had become the only event. In Granger, the storm arrived at 3:47 in the afternoon. The Harwick Ranch house took the full force of it in its north face. The wraparound porch, constructed for the long summer evenings that had made the investment seem visionary, caught the wind where a sail catches wind. All of it, without deflection. Within 40 minutes, the porch roof separated at the joist with a crack that registered through the interior walls and was not heard again because the noise that followed was louder than the breaking had been. The exposed north wall, board and batten over pine framing, no earthen mass, no ridge between it, and 300 miles of open Dakota plains, began surrendering its interior temperature at a rate the 2 cast iron stoves could not reverse. Harwick had installed those stoves at considerable expense, and they had seemed extravagant in June. By 6 in the evening, both burned at maximum, and the temperature inside the structure was still falling. The $4,200 investment had one flaw that no one had asked about, and the builder had not volunteered. The high, exposed position to produce a magnificent western view in summer made the house a standing target in winter, and this winter had come with the accumulated force of a continent's worth of cold pressing southward through months of unbroken clear sky. By midnight, the interior temperature of the Grand Ranch house was 22 degrees Fahrenheit. 6 men pressed against each other in the stoves and fed the flames with dining chairs, then with the sideboard, then with the frames of the imported glass windows when those windows cracked against the cold. The weather vane tore free from the cupola and disappeared into the dark, without a sound that could be heard above the wind. 40 miles away, it would be found in a creek bed in March. Inside the earthen structure set into the low-ground ridge, the stove burned at its measured, deliberate pace. Elias had spent the first hour of the storm doing what he had prepared to do. He fed the horses, broke the ice beginning to form over the outside cistern, laid a guide rope between the house door and the stable door, 40 feet of braided hemp, and came back inside before the visibility dropped to nothing. He adjusted the damper. He confirmed the water level. He set the second lamp in the south window where it burned like a fixed point in the white dark, and then he sat at the table with a geography book and ate his supper in the ordered quiet of a man whose preparation had removed the contingency from the situation. Clara had stopped shaking by the time the storm reached its full voice. The sod walls absorbed the sound and reduced it to a low, distant pressure. The way stone reduces rain to something that becomes background rather than emergency. The stove threw heat in long, even waves. The lamp on the table did not move. She ate what he placed before her without speaking, because nothing she could have said would have added anything meaningful to the plain fact of being alive and warm in the center of what was happening outside. The storm lasted 31 hours. It killed 235 people across Nebraska and Dakota Territory, most of them caught between 2 points that had seemed that morning close enough together to be casual about. In Colfax County alone, 22 people did not survive the night. The cattle losses across the high ground ranches were catastrophic. Animals found frozen standing in their pastures, or recovered weeks later under drifts that had formed in minutes. The Great Plains cattle industry, stressed for a decade, broke completely that January and would not recover for 7 years. In the Harwick Ranch house, on the second night of the storm, a ranch hand named Thomas Gale, 24 years old, frostbitten on both hands to the first knuckle, burning a dining room chair for warmth, remembered something. He remembered a man at the Granger hardware counter, talking about chalk and subsoil drainage and the way low ground held temperature, and the other men laughing. He remembered the phrase. He said it aloud, to the dark and freezing room, to no particular audience, the Badger Hole. He said it in a way he never had before. In the morning, he made a decision. If this story has held your attention through the storm, stay with it. What Thomas Gale does in the morning is worth everything that comes before it. Thomas Gale left the Harwick Ranch house at first light on January 13th. The storm had dropped to a sustained 40 miles per hour. The temperature stood at minus 21 degrees. He wrapped his coat around his head and face, left his frostbitten hands inside his sleeves where they were marginally warmer than the open air, and walked south, keeping the wind at his left shoulder and the chalk ridge line barely visible as a gray discontinuity on the white horizon. He had no precise knowledge of the earthen house's location. He knew only what he had heard years before and half dismissed as a local joke, low ground, south of the ridge, somewhere near the county road marker at mile 12. He fell 3 times. The third time he stayed down for what might have been 2 minutes or 10. He could not afterward say, pressing his face into the snow, because the wind at ground level was measurably calmer than the wind at standing height, and this distinction, small as it was the difference between continuing and not continuing. He thought about warmth not as a concept, but as a specific physical thing with dimensions and temperature and smell. He got up. He found the guide rope by walking into it, the braided hemp line catching him at hip height in the white nothing, and he stood for a moment in complete incomprehension before the meaning of it became clear. Then he followed it. The door was set 3 feet below the surrounding surface, low and plain, without ornament. He knocked because he was from a place where you knock at doors regardless of circumstances, and the door opened almost immediately. Elias Cord had been watching to the south window since first light, tracking the shape resolving slowly from the white, and the warmth that came through the opening struck Thomas Gale in the face, not like entering a warm room, but like being met by something that had no perimeter. It smelled of pine smoke and cornbread, in particular mineral warmth of earth that has been lived in and carefully tended. Clara had a blanket around his shoulders before the door closed behind him. She took his hands, both white to the first knuckle, the skin hard and dry as chalk, and held them between her palms and said something in a quiet, even voice that Elias could not hear from across the room, but that seemed to reach the man directly, because the shaking that had been running through his entire body began very slowly to release its grip. Thomas Gale ate 3 bowls of bean soup. He slept for 6 hours. When he woke, he wept briefly against the wall with his face turned away, and then he sat up and said, "There are 6 more of us up there." Elias made 4 trips. He and Thomas Gale, once the sustained wind dropped below 30 miles per hour, extended the guide rope with a second length of hemp and went back up the ridge together. They brought 2 men down at a time. Each trip required the better part of 3 hours in each direction, and each departure from the earthen house demanded the complete expenditure of the warmth rebuilt in the interval between, so that every return was the same discovery made fresh. The weight of cold releasing from the shoulders in waves, the stove of physical presence felt before it was seen, the temperature change registering as something closer to emotion than sensation. The 5th trip was Elias alone. Douglas Harwick had refused to leave on the 4th attempt, and the men who came down without him said this without judgment, because all of them understood, in their particular way, that some men require the final removal of every remaining option before they can accept help from the last person they expected to receive it from. The grand ranch house, when Elias walked through it for the first and only time, smelled of burned wood and a particular exhaustion of people pushed past the edge of comfort into something more elemental. The north window had cracked in 2 places and been stuffed with a coat. The interior temperature was 19 degrees. Douglas Harwick sat in the one remaining chair with 2 buffalo robes around his shoulders, and when he looked up at Elias Cord standing in his doorway, he said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "I can't make it on my own." It was the first completely honest thing he had said about himself in years. The underground house held 9 people for 4 days. Elias rationed the food at 900 calories per person per day, enough to sustain core temperature without drawing the stores below recovery. The root cellar, stocked with the calculations of a man who prepared for exactly what he had hoped would never arrive, held without shortfall. The walls held. The temperature held. The storm lifted on January 15th. When the survivors walked out onto the plain, the county road was drifted to 6 feet in the low places and scoured the frozen bare ground on the high. The Harwick ranch house was visible from a ridge, standing, but stripped, the porch absent, the cupola gone, the north wall dark with weather staining. Harwick stood in the open air and looked at his $4,200 investment, and then down at the earthen structure below the ridge line, and he said to the cold, open air, to no particular audience, I built in the wrong place. 6 men heard him say it. By the time the road to Granger was passable, the phrase that had traveled ahead of survivors through every farm and station along the route was not the one that had defined Elias Cord for 3 years. It was Cord's refuge. If this account has been worth your time, a like or a comment takes 30 seconds and carries stories like this one further than you might expect. One chapter remains, and it is a different kind of indication entirely. The spring of 1888 came late and cold, and when it came to a different county. 6 homestead families broke ground on new structures that seasoned in the district surrounding Cottonwood Creek, and every one of them made the same journey first. South on the county road to the low ground, to the structure that had no weather vane and no wraparound porch and no newspaper coverage, to stand in the bowl of Elias Cord's claim, and listen while he explained the chalk layer and the subsoil drainage and the orientation of the south-facing wall. He was not a natural teacher in any performative sense. He did not pace or use his hands for emphasis. He spoke only what he had tested and found to be true, and he said it once. And that particular quality, the quality of a man who never says more than he knows, made his instruction permanent in a way that enthusiasm cannot manufacture. He charged nothing for any of it. Clara Wren had not left. There had been no formal negotiation, no proposal assembled in language and answered in kind. The storm had passed. The survivors had returned to their properties, and she had remained, and the two of them had worked side by side through February and into March without discussing what that meant, until it ceased to require discussion. In March, Elias asked her something that was not, on its surface, a proposal, but contained one at its center, and she answered in a way that was not, on its surface, an acceptance, but was entirely one, and this had been sufficient for both of them. She brought something to the land that it had lacked, a second pair of eyes reading the same evidence and arriving at different conclusions, which together made the reading more accurate than either one had been alone. By 1890, the building method that had originated in the low ground of Colfax County had been documented by a state agricultural surveyor and referenced in a Nebraska farming almanac under the heading, Cord Method of Cold Climate Homestead Construction. The entry described the thermal mass principle, the subsoil drainage requirement, and the south wall orientation formula. It credited Elias Cord by name. He read the entry once, set the almanac on the shelf beside his father's Bible, and went back to the south field. Douglas Harwick rebuilt his ranch house in 1889, working with a contractor who had spent the previous season in the low ground district. The new structure was set into a hillside. Harwick told people it had been his own design. No one who had spent 4 days at Cord's refuge the previous January corrected him. Not out of kindness, but because the correction had already been administered in a language that could not be argued with and did not need to be repeated. Elias Cord died in the spring of 1911, 63 years old, in the same earthen room where he had read his geography book while the great blizzard raged outside 23 years before. He had been ill through one winter and was gone before the second thaw. The county received the news without the ceremony it deserved, and then rectified this inadequacy, as counties sometimes do, through a slow accumulation of small acts of acknowledgement that eventually cohered into something permanent. Clara outlived him by 14 years. She remained in the structure, expanded now to include 2 additional rooms and a proper south window, but retaining its original form in every essential particular, the 3-foot sod walls, the earth roof, the low ceiling with salvaged railroad ties, the cast iron stove that had not been replaced, and she was present at every subsequent commemoration, sitting in the same chair beside the same stove, answering questions when they were asked. She would sometimes say, without prompting, that he had never considered himself exceptional, that he had simply considered himself attentive. The county voted in 1912 to rename the Mile 12 section of the county road. The name appeared on the surveyor's plat, and on the painted wooden sign said at the junction, Cord's Refuge Road. The structure was deeded to Colfax County in 1919 by Clara Court, with one condition attached, that it be maintained in functional order and open to the public on the 12th of January each year, the anniversary of the storm. For more than a decade after the first commemoration, people came on that date regardless of weather. Old men who had been young ranch hands in the winter of 1888, children and grandchildren of settlers who had built on the cord method, a woman from Omaha who said her grandfather had been caught on the quarter-mile road between the schoolhouse and his home on the afternoon of January 12th and had turned back in time only because a neighbor, one who had built earth shelter in the previous year, working from instructions given without charge of the low ground claim, had kept a lamp burning in the south window all through the night. They would stand inside those walls and feel the warmth held there, and they would understand something that did not require language to be complete. The plaque mounted beside the door in 1923 read, in letters cut into oak, built 1886, Elias Cord. This ground was called worthless. Outside, on every January 12th, the plains continue to do what the plains do. Wind from the northwest, sky the color of iron, the particular silence that settles in the hour before weather announces itself. And inside, the 3-foot walls held every degree of warmth ever placed in them, quietly, without ceremony, without failure, the same way they had always held it, the same way they always would. Some forms of being right do not announce themselves until the storm arrives to prove it.